Hello, everybody. Mrs. Mills, speaking live from Northampton Business School. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm an associate professor, but don't let that put you off. An anthropologist by training, a problem solver by inclination. And I'm going to have a good old chat with my mate, Liam Fassam here, and he's going to say something about himself.
Very good morning, Liam Fassam, Senior Lecturer, Supply Chain Management, also at the University of Northampton Business School. However, I'm not located with Mills today. I'm in Germany, which displays, I suppose, our new ways of working, Mills.
Very much so. Here we are, united by technology and the common purpose of wanting to take a different perspective on what's going on in the world. So we've chosen 3 topics, haven't we, Liam, to talk about today. We're going to lead off by looking at the case of Holland and Barrett, which is in the news in the UK at the very moment. Then have a little discussion about the ever-declining price of oil in the world, which is great news for me and my enormously thirsty truck. And then finally, the unfortunate news about the job losses with Tata Steel in the UK. So, shall I lead off with Holland and Barrett then, Liam?
Certainly. So flip into that screen.
Yeah, so a few words of background here. Here's Holland and Barrett doing a very old-fashioned practice, it strikes me, but Liam knows much more about supply chains than me. Going to its suppliers and saying, we like what you're giving us and we love stocking it in our shops, but if you want to keep doing it, you're going to need to reduce your costs by 5% and also contribute to a nice slush fund, a security slush fund of £3 million to pay for security tags and CCTV. Meanwhile, the company made over 12% profit last year and is owned by an American-based venture capital fund. So clearly it's in the news. Holland and Barrett are not, I would suggest, not going to look good coming out of this. Is this what they should have done, Mr. Fassam?
Well, it can be very subjective, but I quite like the quote in here from the Forum of Private Business, who've described this as, I quote, a smash and grab raid on the supply chain. I think that sort of sums it up. I don't think you should pay to be part of a supply chain, especially if we look at global ethics and the way things are moving. We take things like circular economies and how we're supposed to engage with people and be friendly with each other and share information. I can't see how this is fostering the collaborative effort, Mills.
Yeah, I very much think you're right. And as we discussed this before we started recording, it did remind both of us of the practice of Tesco's in the past, which I'm sure you'll say something about in the past. And Tesco's, I don't think, would do anything like this these days because it is dreadful publicity. And this line about smash and grab, it does feel kind of almost beyond unethical to what probably the person on the Clapham omnibus or propping up a bar somewhere would describe as kind of fraudulent, really.
It is, and you've got to think of like holistic supply chain practices in here as well. If we, like you mentioned, Tesco, which is a really a great example, and amongst many other retailers, let's just put that out there, who've been subject to the same practices. Yeah, and they caught a cold towards the back end of last year. We don't need to go back over what happened there, but the supplier engagement and the way procurement teams were being incentivized to basically screw down suppliers was nothing short of unethical, and it was in varying presses, including supply chain management from SIPs, were lambasting them for that. And they've taken a strategic decision at the back end of last year to change this behaviour, and they've realised that this isn't becoming of a proper engaging and collaborative supply chain. And you've got to question other elements that are coming in, and I don't mean to jump around too much, but you've got this whole Modern Slavery Act that was brought in by the government last year, which only works if you've got collaboration and visibility and traceability with suppliers. By screwing down your suppliers, you're certainly not, I don't think anyway, embracing the auspices of that. So I think, it's 2 points of it. It's got a cost issue, it's got a collaboration issue with suppliers.
Yeah, I agree, and I also think the reputational damage of this is going to be pretty substantial. Even if it just dies as a story after a day or two, I still think it will have done a lot of harm. Is the reputational cost and the loss of goodwill from worth the cash that they're hoping to get? And I kind of think it isn't. I think it's a very unwise thing to do. And the second thing about ethics is it seems a very strange company to do something like this. Health foods, natural remedies, that's what they're all about. I'm going to shamelessly steal an angle from my wife here, who said it seems very strange for a company that sells homeopathic remedies, that's water, and supplements that we basically don't need because most of us have got nice, reasonably balanced diets, and lots of vegan and vegetarian and other products, to be behaving in this way. It seems to be quite in contradiction to the sort of space that they're operating in, which is the wholesome, natural, feel-good lifestyle, kind to the planet stuff. You mentioned the word kind earlier, Liam, and then suddenly you've got this really hard-edged, maybe uber American, perhaps, culture being expressed.
You're absolutely right, and credit to Anya there. Your good lady wife, who clearly, being the wife, is always right. She's picked up exactly what Ian Castor, managing director of FPP, has said this morning. He said he's quoted as saying that he's surprised at the unwholesome attitude of Holland and Barrett, given their brand. So clearly, it's something that's resonated with the public. But in balance, and going back to Tesco and many other things, you mentioned dairy earlier. Perhaps you want to pick up on that later. But we've seen stories that are far worse and far more unethical out there. In the banking sector, we've seen all sorts of stuff with RBS and Barclays in the past. We've seen things last year with Tesco. Dare I mention the Volkswagen scandal? How do these things, and have they got an effect on brand? Or is the brand so powerful that, the likes of you and I, although today it's quite key, and it will resonate with us, and we'll all have a view on it. By tomorrow, we'll forget about it because something else will come along.
Yeah, possibly so. I mean, that's quite a cynical approach to take on it, and rightly so. But maybe the judgment that's been made at board level, that there will be a storm, but it'll be a little local one, and it's not a cyclone that will rip the roof off the business, more a little bit of a pitter patter of rain against the window. I mean, I think it's remarkable that the company, as it is, makes 12% selling that kind of stuff on the high street, and no doubt it's got an online presence as well. That's pretty good. Clearly, they want to make more, and then be shot of it, presumably. So I guess they're leaning it ready for sale to someone else. But all in all, it seems to leave a bitter taste in the mouth, as it were. But as you say, maybe it will all just be done and dusted over in a day or two, and they'll weather the storm like Tesco has, like the big banks have, and like Volkswagen probably will.
I mean, there is. I don't mean to be cynical about it, but again, looking at this BBC article, they pick up on a very valid point. This is, although I mentioned things like Tesco, banks, and Volkswagen, they all have suppliers that could potentially weather this kind of behaviour. A lot of the suppliers for Holland and Barrett are SMEs. They are very small, family-run businesses who potentially don't have that sort of capital slushing around in their businesses to pay in and buy into this sort of stuff. I mean, arguably, other healthcare organisations will be rubbing their hands together at the moment to get some of the key brands that Holland and Barrett do have. I mean, that's the way I'd be playing it right now. But you think about SMEs, big part of UK's GDP and future, and this isn't very endearing to that sort of market.
No, it doesn't seem to be. And the other thing that hasn't got as much publicity yet is the dairy case, where Muller received an awful lot of positive coverage a few months back for beginning to pay farmers a much fairer price for the high quality milk they're producing. But obviously, it's a global commodity as milk, and the price of it has been dropping like a stone for a very long time. And now Muller have begun to move back on that and are saying to farmers, actually, we're going to need to pay you less, with a predictable concern in rural communities.
Actually, there is a bit of a theme actually going with today's podcast, isn't it, about commodities and decreasing prices? Yeah,
very much, and effects on communities, tight-knit communities. The rural communities are going to be affected by a further decline in the price of milk. Tata Steel is going to hit some communities who have very few other opportunities for work, income generation, setting up small businesses. Well, maybe they will, but it's going to be challenging. Although the economy seems to be getting back into a good place here, there are clearly some losers at the same time. For small suppliers to Holland and Barrett, maybe the importers of pistachios from Iran, that we're going to be talking about shortly as well. maybe those guys are going to be, having to look for alternative outlets as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it is worth stressing that this behaviour isn't just isolated to Holland and Barrett, and there are many other cases out there. We could probably spend hours talking about this, but it is an interesting case to bring up, and I'd be interesting to see what ramifications there are for the brand, if at all any, and further what statement the company's going to make. That'll be interesting.
Yeah, well, I think it's a shame in a way as well, but it's an American venture capitalist fund that seems to be driving this, because the one that's taking over Boots seems to be taking a very different approach, and it seems to be preserving this iconic British brand and the sort of values that go along with it. And Boots seems to be still a very highly successful company without, as far as we know, needing to do things like this. So it's not a necessary requirement of being owned by an American venture capitalist fund. It just looks like it's playing out differently in different parts of the market.
But it does smack of the old quick win philosophy of get some cash into the bottom line, and make things look good. And maybe you're right, it's up for ripe for an acquisition anytime soon. However, that's not really going to be helpful to the SMEs supplying that company this morning.
It's really not. No, exactly. Oh, well, on to something then which is helping quite a few people in terms of their monthly outgoings, their bills. I'm certainly noticing it with cheaper diesel for my huge truck. The massive declines in the price of oil. Good news for everybody, Mr. Fassam.
Yeah, Reuters headline this morning: oil slumps $28 or below $28 to 2003 low as Iran sanctions lifted. I saw something interesting last night on the news while I was plonked on the couch trying to forget about the world. That the price of the contents of a barrel is now cheaper than the vessel that's holding it. So the barrel is actually worth more than the contents.
Yeah, and mineral water and all sorts of other commodities being described as more expensive than oil at the moment. Yeah. Well, it's pretty impressive given where we were a year or so ago, and it's got all sorts of wonderful knock-on effects for things like the surcharge on airline tickets. As I noticed the other day, everyone stopped talking about that because that's all gone away, a dim and distant memory. And with the thawing of relations with Iran, the release of prisoners, by the looks of it, the end of their potentially militarised nuclear weapons program, that's all looking good. A rare beam of positivity from that part of the world.
Well, I see some interesting stuff. I mean, I clearly logistician operations guy, so I'm focusing on the cost here. A couple of things. I haven't seen my weekly commute, my airline ticket, reduce in price. It is still the same price as it was 2 years ago. So although the surcharge has decreased, they haven't really passed on any savings to the
there's an interesting point. Now, why hasn't that caught on with the general public, who clearly are after as much value as they can get from their airlines these days? And isn't there an opportunity there for someone like EasyJet or Ryanair to stand out from a pack and sort of say, actually, we can pass on our fuel savings to you rather than only to our shareholders?
Well, I think it would be an interesting thing to do. And if we think about other modes of transport, I haven't seen any bus companies reducing ticket prices either. The largest cost they will have will be fuel, followed closely by staff costs. I haven't seen massive rises in wages this year. I've seen massive decreases in oil. So, okay, I'm not an accountant, but yeah, I can work out what's happening to their margins. Same with train companies. We've just had that's quite an emotive subject at the moment. We've had another increase, yet commodities are going down. So I'd be interested to see what's happening here. You were talking about business ethics earlier, Mills. Where does this sit?
You raised some issues I hadn't really thought about. I mean, over the decades, we've all been taught that our entire economies, food ingredients, much of the clothing we wear, unless they're natural fibres, paints, dyes, plastics, everything, it all comes from oil. And yet, although we've seen a decrease in the price of petrol, diesel at the pump, beyond that, we haven't seen much in the way of deflation, despite everything depending, apparently, on this magic source of, and it is pretty incredible what you can get from crude oil. But yeah, it looks like some people are holding on to margin which they perhaps don't deserve to, or it's unwise to, reputationally.
I think you're right, and I don't, I don't have an answer to that. I'm not purporting that companies should be reducing it, but in supply chain terms, we're talking for many years, about fuel surcharges. This is all, been eradicated now, but I'm not seeing the cost of logistics dropping. The average cost of logistics has remained static. Clearly, it has become more efficient to counteract the increasing rise of oil over the years. So so if you're an investor in that sector now, you'd be rubbing your hands together. Not a few years ago you wouldn't, but there is another sort of area to this that's quite interesting. Is, again, I mentioned circular economy earlier on, and we're talking about ethics of companies. The recycling industry and what you and I put into the bin, the plastics that get recycled, that industry is being decimated because of oil. Because the price of oil is so cheap now, why would you use a recycled piece of kit when you can just make new? It's cheaper.
Well, okay. The alternative being to chuck it in the ground if you're still allowed to do that in the particular jurisdiction in which you live,
or burn it,
or burn it for more fuel, which we could perhaps generate more cheaply through another source. Yeah. So is it a time then for companies to spring up to stockpile plastics that would have been recycled and reused, or maybe cracked and turned into oil until the inevitable time when oil prices rise, or will they never rise again to the heights we've seen?
I don't know, but part of me is looking at this and thinking, well, a few years ago, oil was not an infinite resource, and we need to look at alternative energies. And the headlines are just now saying, how wonderful it is. We've never seen petrol drop below £1 a litre. That the whole ethos of recycling or alternative energies, or the fact that oil will run out potentially at some point, has been lost. I don't know, maybe it's a bit of sensationalist going on because we're all so shocked with what's happening. But coming back to the point, I mean, Iran sanctions being lifted. What do you think? Has it helped it or worsened the cause, Mills?
Of what change in Iran?
Well, in terms of pricing.
I think opening up Iran has got to be good. I mean, I think it's a very problematic country. I mean, they have a lot of practices which are pretty anathema to human rights of the civilized world, and they're certainly very enthusiastic about executing people. But it does have a very proud history, a very talented and youthful workforce with high levels of training in engineering, medicine, and other things. Lots of things are set fair as long as political change can occur and in hopefully a managed way. But look at the other things they're doing. They're buying 104. They'd like to buy 114 Airbuses, which is great news for European business and the supply chain there, and preserves jobs in France and Germany and the northern parts of England and other places, which is all great. And then the other knock-on effect, I'm a bit obsessed about aircraft today, because the price of oil is so low at the moment. British Airways are continuing to fly their 747s, which are now considerably less efficient than the 777 or the A380, just because they can now make them efficient because the price of fuel has dropped below a certain point. So the strategies of all sorts of companies are adopting and are adapting to a future which they probably hadn't predicted.
And that comes back to earlier. Is this the strategy changing? Is this the ethical side of business changing? While we're talking about vehicles or transportation modes, there was a big thing before Christmas about ships being inefficient and running empty when they go eastbound back to China and blah blah blah, so on and so forth. That's a moot point now, it would seem, because the price of oil has dropped, so the focus has shifted.
Yeah, and yet they're still pumping out the same amount of pollutants, carbon dioxide, particulates, etc., etc. So actually, nothing's changed.
That's a whole different podcast in itself. Sulfur diesel and the effects on. Yeah. But I quite like. I'm watching this whole Iranian thing with interest because I'm, as you know, and like yourself, I quite like disruptive innovation, and I'm wondering how much disruptive innovation is going to be brought now into this world because there are, like you said, a lot of smart things in Iran, and it's been sat there with its doors closed to the world, and it'll be jumping onto the stage wanting to show that it is a player and it has ways to contribute. And I would imagine that there are certain other players in the world sitting very nervous at the moment due to that disruptive innovation and things like prices of oil.
Yeah, especially those regional players who haven't managed to diversify their economies fast enough and are still dependent on turning the taps down on a cartel which is ever less relevant. Yeah. Kind of unfortunate for them, but kind of fair as well, I think, in a kind of a karma type way.
It is. So,
anyway, all right. Well, on to something which is not fair in a karma type way, and that's effect on communities in the UK of tartar reducing their capacity to produce steel in the UK. Obviously, we've got a long and very proud and emotional connection with the steel industry and coal before it and associated with it in this country. More bad news.
It is. I'm looking at the Financial Times. Port Talbot, 750 job cuts. You all have seen if you did get to see the news last night, was rather depressing. It's not just Port Talbot. I mean, even up local to our university, I was seeing people at the plant in Corby. Although it hasn't been muted yet, they're pretty much sitting there going, well, the writing is on the wall.
Yeah, desperate times, I think. And the unfortunate thing is that these plants are, I assume, as lean as they possibly can be. They've invested as much money as was wise to do in bringing them up to emission standards and cutting fat out of both the workforce and the production systems. And yet still, against the tide, inverted commas, of cheap Chinese steel, not competitive.
No, and there's a couple of points we talked about the procurement ethics, which we can come on to in a second. I mean, part of me sits and questions all of this. I sat here in Germany, in Saarland, which has a very proud steel manufacturing history as well, and it's still thriving today. We're not having the same challenges here in Germany that appear to be happening in the UK. But if I cast my mind back a few years to when the bubble burst in Europe and we were starting on the journey of recession, the German government made a decision that it wanted to maintain the steel industry and other industries as well, automotive and other regions, and put it down to a 3-day working week. And the government actually funded the other 2 days. The government took a decision that actually putting 2,000 people out of work in the long term is going to cost us much more money than investing in a couple of days. And the local industry were able to use those 2 days to create innovation. I don't want to overuse that word, but they were able to upskill, train people and put them on courses they were unable to before because they were too busy working. So it had a net benefit to the steel industry locally when things got back running again. And I just wonder whether there's an opportunity to do something similar in the UK.
Yeah, I mean that's quite an exhilarating little example there. I think in the UK, although politicians of whichever political persuasion or interview will always describe coal, steel, manufacturing as strategic industries, historically they've never really been treated as such. I mean, with coal, basically one was fighting a losing battle. If you have to dig it out from pretty dangerous and unpleasant conditions underground versus scooping it off the Earth's surface somewhere else in the world, you've really got no chance of competing against that. Steel, probably very different. But the refrain in this country for a long time from critics of a kind of oscillating way in which governments come and go in terms of their thinking about stuff is that there's never been a longer term view of things, and there's certainly in my experience in central government, there's very little access to the information required to take a cost benefit type analysis, certainly one that runs across more than one parliament. So investing in an industry to get net gain out of paying for 2 non-working days sounds incredibly bold, but also incredibly simple and incredibly smart. And I think, unfortunately, in the UK, we're kind of held back by not thinking strategically. I mean, it's a word that's overused as much as risk or community or diversity or all sorts of things. Used so often it becomes meaningless. But actually, if you were to treat particular industries as strategic assets, you would need to think like this.
Excuse me. I agree. And while you're talking, it got me thinking about where we are in the world's economy. I mean, after all, we are an island economy. We are surrounded by water. We are reliant on imports pretty much for everything. If we just peel it back to food for 1 second, in terms of agri products, and I hope I get my stats right here. So, and if not, I'll update them afterwards. But we are something like 50. We can only support 52% of our agri consumption. Everything else is reliant on imports, and that's getting worse and worse and worse because the government aren't supporting. The government and business aren't supporting our industries, and we see the same with steel. Steel is an integral part of building the future infrastructure. Let this go, and it will be another commodity that we are reliant on imports again. So, it's not, for me, it's not just steel. This is everything to do with manufacturing. And I get the whole moving more into a service economy and all that great stuff. Yeah, I understand that. We still need railway lines. We still need power stations. Let's, not open that debate. And so on and so forth. And it just seems that UK PLC is just outsourcing everything, and we're just happy to be reliant on areas outside our borders, which adds, for me anyway, a huge amount of risk.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think it's quite a lot to expect government to maintain every industry that it might possibly need to rely on for its people. I think that's very difficult to do. But with steel, for example, it's going to cost a ton of money closing these plants down anyway, that the government's going to have to foot the bill for. Then the ongoing benefits and sort of sending people on courses after they've been laid off. Then the effects on people's health and direct effects on that mean they use the NHS more. They're less likely to be able to work. They get skill fade, even if they can find a similar job. If you total up all the effects on the directly employed and then those indirectly through the various supply chains, you must get to a very, very big number. And I would have thought even if you went for the, okay, Tata, you pay for 3 days, we'll pay for 2 days type model, that may well be a cheaper way and a managed transition. So rather than being, at the mercy of global commodity markets, which we actually are, the government could kind of impose some stability on the closure process rather than, okay, it's 2 months or something, and that's it. And we're going to keep on a skeleton crew just to keep the furnaces burning or something, just in case there's a sudden change in the world markets in the next year or so. Why not invest to manage the transition to there being no steel industry in a slower time way and build the infrastructure locally to enable these people either to, well, they're going to have to do something else, aren't they? And it's going to have to be something that they're competent to do. Just dumping them onto the streets with a nice, freshly written CV that a consultant has helped them with is not the solution.
I totally agree with that. I think it's a good point. The government are not the bastions to everything here. I mean, we quite often spend too much time looking at the government and saying, well, what are you going to do about it? I think my views that I see every stakeholder in life as being part of the solution, rather than just reliant on one person to be the solution. What do you call it? Solutioneering earlier, didn't you?
Solutioneering,
I love that word. Yeah, it's going to be the word of the month. And a slow reduction in capacity would be a good thing. And with my logistics hat on, there is a huge skill shortage in logistics at the moment. I mean, massive. There's potentially, you could turn this on its head and say, well, actually, you know what? As we start to mothball sites, and you know, although I appreciate you can't necessarily mothball steel plants once they're closed, is that we, as an industry, start to turn areas like Port Talbot into logistics centres of excellence, and put inward investment regionally to say, you know what, UK, although we're an island nation, we could become a logistics centre of excellence for Europe. We got hundreds of thousands of jobs going in the industry. So there's an opportunity here as well. Has there been a negative?
Yeah, I mean, a clue might then be in the name, might it? Port Talbot. It's a bit of a port.
Indeed.
So, do you think it would be completely wild to imagine that the logistics industry could, or major players in it, could open facilities in that area? I mean, is there a reason why they're not doing stuff there already? That a little bit of incentive from government might help? transform that area into some kind of hub.
Amazon have got huge warehouses in Wales, and they got a lot of investment from the Welsh Authority to build them there, and they're doing really well. No, there's no reason at all why you can't do it there. I mean, there's logistics facilities in Northampton. I mean, people turn around and say it's because it's centrally located. Well, yeah, arguably, but it's not in the. It's no better off than Port Talbot, to be honest. You've got a railway line that goes straight to London. Wherever you build the facilities, academic, excuse the pun, on the basis of the infrastructure that surrounds it. So if you've got a good railway line and some good motorways that aren't congested, yeah, you knock yourself out. I mean, there's nothing stopping you. You're on the west coast of England, which means you're even closer to the Mediterranean. Those big ships cost a lot of money to keep steaming around to Rotterdam. If you could get some sort of deep sea berth there, the ship has half a day's less steaming. When these things are burning 200 tons of fuel an hour or whatever it is that they burn these days, there's a lot of cost that you can save. You've got a railway line that goes straight through London to a tunnel that goes under the ground into Europe. There's all sorts of disruptive, innovative logistics things you could do here, and smart things, if you just had a bit of investment.
And the incredibly low price of oil wouldn't necessarily be a barrier to that.
No, you could have ships coming into the west coast, and you could be feeding into London. You can be feeding straight up the line to Birmingham. You could be feeding straight past London and into Europe if you wanted to.
Right, so being in Wales, we often think of it as a province far away from the centre of power in the nation. Could actually not be a detriment at all.
Well, no, and if you bring into effect the, what do you call it, TTIP, the transatlantic agreement between our good selves and the US, you start getting great stuff. Jaguars in Birmingham, it's only down the road from Wales. Pop them on a ship, get them over to America, and start importing stuff in from the US. All of a sudden, you become a strategically important port for US-European relations. And let's not forget our Irish cousins as well, that are pretty much the Silicon Valley of Europe, who build and manufacture lots of bits of IT kit. Wales isn't far from there. It's just a ferry ride, and you're not putting 2 or 3 days overland in a truck. So I think it's a negative, but I think there's opportunities here if the investment is right.
Blimey. Well, that's good. It appears then, Liam, that we've ended on quite a positive note, which is quite unusual for academics to finish a conversation with some options that policymakers and business could put into place to make the world a better place. And we've come to a conclusion we didn't necessarily expect ourselves to come to today.
No, which is always a nice surprise. So
exactly. All right, then. So we'll say goodbye to all our hopefully loyal and faithful followers who are going to be watching more and more of our little chats, and we'll have guests now and again as well joining us. And feel free to tweet either of us or both of us with any questions or topics you'd like our particular, some would say peculiar,